Rotational grazing. In the horse utopia system, we use rotational grazing. So this is just where the horses only have access to one paddock out of a number of paddocks at a time. You also, if you're along a creek or a river, you can have a riparian zone, which is a zone that is fenced off along the river to keep the animals off of it so that it doesn't get overgrazed and to stop erosion from occurring. Watering and feeding becomes simpler and saves time. There's less impact on the land and less compaction of the soil. We use laneways to direct the horses to certain paddocks, and we can also use a sacrifice paddock in the system as well, that we sacrifice for the rest of the grass and the pasture on the land. Here's a picture of a rotational grazing system with laneways. The laneways are in green. I have 2 muster points where the horses are yarded overnight, which are in blue right at the top of the screen. There is a little bit of purple shaded area on the right, which is along a creek, and I use that as a riparian zone, so the horses are only allowed in there for short periods of time and it's not allowed to overgraze. And then the other larger purple shaded area is more or less bushland. The horses also only go in there for short periods of time, otherwise it's not actually grazing land. There is a big deep gully in there and it's just trees, and there's still some very small amounts of lantana and rubber vine in there. So the horses come up, well, they start in the muster point, they're let out in the morning, and their gate is open to whichever paddock they're in at the time. The paddocks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7. Paddocks 7 and 8 are more or less in their own little system by itself on the other side of the house. The horses really only spend a matter of no more than a couple of weeks in each paddock, and it depends on the season, it depends on the grass growth, it depends on the rainfall, and it depends on whether we're in drought or not. There is now, which you've seen in another lecture, a sacrifice paddock right along the front of the road up near muster point in paddock 6. So the horses have actually spent most of their time in that sacrifice paddock, and they've really only been let out into one of the other paddocks for like a couple of hours of pick a day, and sometimes that's not even every day because the grass situation is quite dire. And I'm also trying to keep grass on the ground for when the wet season comes. So the permanent fences were put in on this place before I came up with the whole system, so it would have probably been designed a little bit different if I had have come up with this system before the fencing went in. But this is what I have to work with, so I've made it work. I've also, in some of the paddocks, even temporarily fenced them off even smaller, so the horses have only had access to even a third of, say, paddock number 7. And that's when their time on the paddock is very, very limited each day. So here's another example of how you might incorporate a laneway into a property. It's a very simple one. There's only, I think, 4 paddocks in this system. There's a riparian zone. We've got a hard surface crossing over the creek so it doesn't cause erosion. In the laneways you can have gravel, you can have sand, you can have large logs for them to step up and over. And this is for hoof care and muscle care of the horses. And it gives them a little bit of variety in their day when they're coming backwards and forwards up to their muster point. The water and the hard feed, if you hard feed your horses, is only provided in the muster point. So the purpose of the muster point is for horses to come up and get their feed and water and do some loafing up there, and then they go back down to the paddock to graze for a few hours, which is usually 2 to 3 hours at a time, and then they'll come back up for a drink. So the more time that they spend in the laneways and coming up for water or feed, the less time they're actually impacting the paddocks. This is a smaller property again. For example, you can see in the bottom right hand corner it's very well grazed. That horse needs to be probably moved over onto the left hand top corner paddock very shortly. All the paddocks can be at different stages of growth, and also the different soil types will determine how fast and what types of grass and plants are in each paddock. So you won't necessarily have to rotate your horses in a particular order. You'll just choose the paddock that's right at the time. So a wild horse, this is not on this page, a wild horse like a Brumby can walk up to 50 kilometres in one day. That's why they've usually got really good hooves, and they're looked after very well, like they look after their own hooves very well. So a horse that's kept in a really, really small paddock can only walk up to 4.5 kilometres per day, and that's probably at the most, depending on how they're kept. They graze in lots of approximately 2 to 3 hours, and then they will do the rest of the time loafing, which is grooming, resting, or playing. The aim of getting the horse to do their loafing and their hard feed eating in the muster point is to reduce the pressure on the paddock. The less time the horse spends on the pasture, the more time it has to rejuvenate. So set stocking is how it's been done in the old days, and some people still do it. So it's when it's horses or cattle. One large paddock has a horse or cattle that has access to the whole paddock the whole of the time. So everything the horse or the cattle does throughout the day is impacting the pasture growth. This is where the rotational grazing comes in. So you split your paddocks up into a smaller number of paddocks. You can use laneways, you can use to connect the paddocks, you can use temporary electric fencing to split the paddocks even smaller again, and make sure the horse really only has access to one paddock at a time, giving the other paddocks much more time to rest and rejuvenate. It is recommended a minimum of 70 days for that paddock to rest and rejuvenate, but depending on the size of the property and the seasons and the climate you live in, that will change drastically. So the muster point where you keep your horses in overnight should be a suitable surface. It doesn't have to be concrete. I've got road base in mine. It's still all right on their hooves. You can have it's recommended to have a shelter of some kind. If it's a big muster point area, you could also use that as your sacrifice area. It's recommended not to leave the animals out in your paddocks in periods of lots of heavy rain, because that will increase the compaction, and they'll also chop it up because that's their favourite time to go galloping around the paddock. You should locate your muster point somewhere that's handy for you, near the shed or the house, so that feeding is simpler and takes less time. Make sure it's large enough to keep your horses, however many horses you have in there. And don't provide water in any of the other paddocks, otherwise they'll have less reason to come down to the muster point and get off the grass. So the benefits also, there's less manure in the paddocks, which is less parasites and less poo picking up, if that's what you do in your area. The parasites and larvae eggs will die off if left for long enough without a host. So this is like, depending on the temperature. If the temperature is over, I think 27.5 degrees for a number of days in a row, this will kill off most of the larvae and eggs in your manure. If you use hot composting, this with the manure from your muster point, this will also kill off parasites if you do the proper technique for hot composting. Pasture can be rested and left to seed, less compaction of the soil, and then you'll also have less bare ground patches. The only places I've got bare ground now in my paddocks are the laneways, which you really can't do much about. I have lined a few of the laneways with gravel, and then the only other bare patches up in the paddock is where there's really, really poor quality grass that I'm slowly getting to bit by bit. So that's your benefits and how rotational grazing and your muster point works. Put it into place and see how it works for you.